Hello, my name is Alphonso David, and I'm the president of the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in the country and around the globe. Today, I'm having a conversation with the esteemed mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. Mayor Bottoms, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
We're still standing, so we're doing good. A long way to go in our city, as is across the country, but we're still standing. Thank you for asking. How are you doing?
Well, this COVID-19 has really disrupted all of our lives. It's had such a dramatic impact on the LGBTQ community, on Black and Brown communities. And we are doing our best to make sure that we're providing support, resources for the community, and make sure that people have the information that they need in order to navigate this very complicated landscape.
Well, and that's why it's so important for us to have this conversation today. This has been an extraordinary summer in so many ways. And even with the Supreme Court ruling that came down recently, I want to get your thoughts on that and what you see as the work that remains to be done, and what, if anything, can the Supreme Court do?
So, Mayor Bottoms, you're exactly right. The Supreme Court issued a very significant decision that LGBTQ people are protected under federal civil rights laws. Now, lower federal courts have issued similar decisions for more than 20 years. Yet, opponents of LGBTQ equality challenged whether we should be protected. And the Supreme Court responded with a resounding yes. This ruling is really significant, but it is not the end of our struggle. Unfortunately, in 29 states in this country, there are no comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. So someone runs the risk of being discriminated against in housing or public accommodations or credit, which is why we are pushing for comprehensive federal legislation to protect LGBTQ people. The legislation is called the Equality Act. We're also pushing for protections in states across the country as well. I know that Atlanta is one of the cities that does provide comprehensive protections, but Georgia, unfortunately, does not. So, Mayor Bottoms, could you just talk a little bit about what advances you have made in Atlanta and how you think what steps you think we still have to take in the city of Atlanta for LGBTQ equality?
So we began by talking about COVID-19, and at the onset of COVID-19, my charge to our team was God bless the child who's got its own. And that really has been our approach as it relates to all matters related to the LGBTQ community. And you're right, we don't always have the guidance and support of the state, but we try to really be an example in hopes that others will follow in our state. Within 100 days of my being sworn into office, I appointed our first ever LGBTQ affairs coordinator in the city of Atlanta, a young man, Malik Brown, who is a complete rock star. But it was very clear that Malik. It was very clear that we weren't giving the focus and really visibly saying to the public that this is a community that we value. And with Malik's leadership, it has been absolutely incredible. Our first budget, we set aside money for HIV and AIDS support services, which had never been done in our city's budget before. We have also appointed a chief health officer who, before COVID, was completely focused on helping to reduce our HIV and AIDS rates in Atlanta, which are amongst the highest in the country. And also, ironically, she's now having to focus on COVID, which we know has proven to be more deadly for communities that often have underlying health conditions. And we push forward asking the state to refrain from supporting conversion therapy, which has been extremely important. Also, taking on matters related to housing. And what I would say is we've not always gotten it right. And there have been some bumps along the way, but it's been so incredibly helpful to us to have a person and a team completely focused on all things related to the LGBTQ community, so that when we do hit those bumps in the road, we really have a roadmap for us to try and fix it, and improve on the work that's already being done.
Now, you're certainly someone who knows about representation and why representation is so important. We need a pro-equality Senate to pass the Equality Act in Congress. And Georgia has 2 seats that are up for grabs in 2020. What can people do to get involved and help elect pro-equality senators in Georgia?
Well, and just the fact that we have 2 Senate seats up this year is extraordinary. That rarely, if ever, happens. And so this year, we are really focusing on educating people on who the candidates are and what their positions are. And we have some very talented Democrats who are running for these positions. And we know that the Democratic Party, by and large, has been supportive of so many of these initiatives. And then the other part of that is encouraging people to show up and vote. Voter suppression is very real. We saw it in our primary just recently in Georgia. And so we have been telling people, you've got to run up the numbers in such a way by turning out to vote that there is no margin for error. And I think that it is extremely important for us to really call on the candidates who are running to articulate what their positions are, so that we can have them on the record to show that they support the things that we care about as a community as a whole.
Now, you mentioned voter suppression, which is such a significant issue. As you know, at the Human Rights Campaign, we have been working all over the country to make sure that we address voter suppression issues. In fact, we recently launched an initiative called Vote Equal, Vote Safe. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Are you familiar with the Vote Equal, Vote Safe initiative?
No, I'm not.
So our initiative essentially works to make sure that we are informing people about the different options that are available to them. Our work center is really on 3 key areas. We want to engage LGBTQ voters and equality voters. These are voters who prioritize LGBTQ issues at the ballot box. And we're engaging them to ensure that they know all of their voting options and they know about how to navigate the process. We're also advocating at the federal, the state, and the local levels for funding to make sure that we have expanded voting options. And then finally, we're doing research to ensure that LGBTQ voters and equality voters are comfortable using all available options for safe and flexible voting. So that includes, but it's not limited to, vote by mail. We're also talking about making sure we have more early voting options, as well as making sure that we have more polling stations opened during Election Day. And, you know, because we are living through COVID-19, it makes it even more complicated. So I guess one of my questions for you is, how has COVID-19 affected the city of Atlanta?
We've been hard hit with COVID-19, and primarily because of our large African American community and the inequitable access to healthcare. And I was just looking at some numbers today that showed the African American community in Atlanta is responsible for about 52.6%, I believe was the number of COVID infection rates, but the death rate is around 86%. So the disparity is very real. And I was talking to a friend who's a minister at a very big church in Atlanta recently, and he told me he normally does 2 to 3 funerals a month, and he's doing 2 to 3 a week now. And I said, is it because of COVID? And he said, no, it's because people aren't going to the doctor. And so there's this other part of COVID that's devastating our communities as well, because we know it's often difficult to get people to see about their routine health care. And then you layer on COVID and people are afraid to go into a hospital or doctor's office when they feel sick or perhaps may be experiencing a medical emergency, and it's making it that much more devastating. And this is why it's been so important in Atlanta. One of the other things that I did early on in my administration was to create a LGBTQ advisory board made up of a cross-section, very diverse section of people across the city, so that they can give to us recommendations on how, as we're dealing with these very large issues like COVID, how do we give particular focus to many of our communities that are often underlooked and overlooked and underserved. And they've been a great help. And part of the discussions have been, even during COVID, our housing of our LGBTQ community and our youth and people who may be experiencing homelessness or facing evictions because loss of job and not being able to access medical care and prescriptions. And just to add additional support to our communities who are experiencing challenges with COVID, we have created specifically a LGBTQ resource guide to help our communities navigate all of the things they may be facing as it relates to COVID-19. So we've been hit hard, as so many communities across the country have been.
I'm so happy to hear you talking about the steps that you've taken to make sure that LGBTQ people and other marginalized groups are protected. For example, most people don't know that LGBTQ people are disproportionately working in industries that have been affected by COVID-19. They've had large scale backs, they've had furloughs, they've had firings, leaving many LGBTQ people struggling to know where they will get the next paycheck. More LGBTQ people already live in poverty compared to other demographic groups. So economically, this pandemic has hit the LGBTQ community very hard. And for instance, and I reference this statistic because many people don't know this, 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people live in poverty. More than half of transgender people overall, 54%, have reported having their work hours reduced due to COVID-19, compared to less than a third of LGBTQ people overall. And the transgender people of color have been disproportionately hit during this pandemic. From a health perspective, LGBTQ people suffer chronic illnesses. We have an increasing number of Black and brown people who are living with HIV, as you know, and they don't have access to healthcare. So those factors increase the chances of bad outcomes after someone contracts COVID-19. And, you know, COVID-19 has certainly taken up so much time and energy and attention in the media, which is incredibly understandable and appropriate. But there is also another issue that has taken up a lot of time and is taking up a lot of attention, and that is policing generally. On June 12th, a 27-year-old man, Rashard Brooks, was shot and killed in an officer-involved shooting in Atlanta. And the next day you said at a news conference that you did not believe the shooting was, quote, justified use of deadly force. And you called for an immediate termination of the officer. You also instituted a number of immediate orders to reform the use of force in policing, quoting the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. saying, there is a fierce urgency of now. Can you talk to us a little bit about those orders that you implemented in Atlanta?
Yeah, so we thought that we had a little more time to look at our use of force policies. President Obama had issued a challenge just before Mr. Brooks was killed, and the challenge was for cities across the country to convene advisory committees to take a look at their use of force policies. We had met for the first time maybe 3 days before Mr. Brooks was killed, and it was this ever-present reminder that we didn't have another day, that we could wait until we comprehensively looked at our policies and began to make changes. And this was a tragedy on so many levels. But what became abundantly clear immediately is that our officers are not equipped with what they need to de-escalate situations like the encounter with Mr. Brooks. So we had issued a series of administrative orders, including requiring our officers to exercise de-escalation techniques when possible, saying that under limited circumstances, can you shoot at a moving car? And some of these were from the 8 can't wait policies that have been set forth. I think as of today, we have hit 7 of the 8. We're looking at the 8th one now. Our advisory committee has continued to meet, and they've made additional recommendations, 10 additional recommendations, 3, excuse me, which we've committed to. That includes creating a repository for these public videos that we often see in when there are allegations of excessive use of force. Also, expanding our Citizens Review Board, which is impaneled to take a look at excessive use of force allegations with our officers, giving them a broader array of powers. And also looking at our usage of body cam videos. We have a 94% usage rate now, but committing to get that even higher. And, you know, the tragedy of it is with all of these policies, it will not bring Mr. Brooks back. But the one thing that his widow shared with me when we spoke was she said, I don't want his death to be in vain. And so it's carrying that in our hearts and on our minds that we're going to continue to push forward. And, you know, the reality is change is difficult. But we've been through this in Atlanta. We went through this as it related to our policing and how we were interacting with our LGBTQ community. When I first came on the council, it was on the heels of a terrible raid on a bar in downtown Atlanta, the Eagle raid. And it was full of all of the things that you shouldn't do when you are interacting with the LGBTQ community. A lot of things had gone wrong. We had to make some changes in our police department that made us a better department. That's what we're faced with today as it relates to interactions, particularly with Black men in our city. And I think in the same way we became a better department on the other side of the Eagle raid, I do believe we'll be a better department on the other side of this.
Now, as we talk more about transforming policing, one of the issues that often comes up relates to funding. And you have talked about Atlanta shifting funding to community-based equity programs. What else can cities do in addition to shifting funding, you think?
Well, I think the work has to be done. Funding is only one part of it, but you can put all of the money in the world behind something, but if you're not doing the work and you're not truly committed to it, then it's going to all be for naught. And again, that's why having advisory committees like our LGBTQ advisory committee is important, because as we're having these conversations, it's important that we have buy-in and input from all of our communities. And what we know is when you talk about some of the homophobic encounters that happen in communities, you layer on another part of that is that interaction with people of color in communities. And so it's important that we not only say we are committed with a funding source, but we are intentional about the work. We're now transforming our city jail into a center of equity, health, and wellness. We have had buy-in and input from communities across Atlanta, including our LGBTQ community, on how this jail can really become a place of healing and a place where people can go and access resources that they need to improve their lives. And we've been able to do it by shifting money from our corrections budget. So we are reimagining public safety in Atlanta and also public interaction with our city, and really taking to heart our responsibility to be a welcoming and inclusive city. And that includes funding sources, but also a place in the space that people can access these resources.
And I know that many have talked about the responsibility that we all have to make sure that we are advancing progressive policies that are inclusive of Black and Brown communities all over this country. So you're certainly doing your part as an elected official. And at the Human Rights Campaign, we are the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in the country and in fact, the world. And what I am doing to make sure that we advance racial justice issues is making sure that racial justice is integral to our mission, not simply a necessary corollary to the work that we do. In fact, we worked with more than 700 LGBTQ organizations around the country to sign on to a letter to say that they would incorporate racial justice issues into the core tenets of their missions. We also worked with more than 350 LGBTQ organizations to sign on to a letter advancing policies that would advocate for divesting from policing and really investing in community-based organizations and individuals who are really qualified to do the work. There is so much work to do, there's so much more work to do, but I know that collectively we can effectuate change. And I want to just thank you for everything that you're doing, for the positions that you've taken to advance social justice and racial justice in Atlanta.
Well, and I just thank you for your leadership and the great partnership and guidance that you all have given the city of Atlanta. You know, I truly believe it's not how many times you fall down, but really how many times you get up. And as a city, we're continuing to get up and try and get it right. And having your leadership and the guidance of the Human Rights Campaign is extremely important to us. And it continues to help us really to be the city that we want to be and that we should be for so many people. So thank you again.
Mayor Bottoms, Mayor of Atlanta, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.